My question, I would like to talk a little bit, share some ideas about what Virgilio said about people-centered approach, and meaning that labor-intensive use of nature-based solutions. I think this is a very great idea, and I fully agree that nature-based solutions have a lot of job creation potential. In my own work, recently we estimated together with colleagues that if all land restoration targets under the 3 Rio Conventions will be implemented successfully, it will create 8 million direct jobs across the world. And probably job creating potential is larger than that through indirect multiplier effect. But there are 2 things I think we need to be very careful and manage very carefully regarding that. First issue is that we assume that all these jobs are paid. People get paid for their labor. But often what happens in some contexts is that people, in the name of collective action by communities, they provide free labor. So collective action is fine when it's voluntary, but it's not a really good idea if community leaders are forcing usually poor and marginalized to provide free labor, and then benefits are hijacked by them. So when you are costing the full labor at the true cost, yeah, in some cases it happens that doing it in the traditional way no longer economically viable. So for example, if you take from Burkina Faso Zai technologies, it works well if you have free labor, community labor, but if you start paying for every labor the market wage, then it becomes very expensive. So that's why, for example, FAO, instead of doing it community way, they tried to mechanize the process, bring in tractors and try to mechanize it in some. So it's also linked to my second point, the link local solutions for local problems. Of course, that's a great idea. But at the same time, I see there is a role for modern science, modern technologies to work together with traditional knowledge, because traditional knowledge, traditional practices were developed for a different climate, for different social, economic conditions often. Societies are changing. For example, another example from Tanzania, this time there was a very traditional Ndivya water harvesting technology, which usually satisfied all the water needs of communities for irrigation and other things. But now water demands are so high, it's no longer enough. They need real pumps to start providing this water. So local solutions for local problems, yes, but with some kind of more open for new technologies as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll ask for comments from the speakers in a moment. I have Aditi, Sheikh, Marcello, Joyce, Rob, and last but not least, our chairman, Jochen. So let's hear from Aditi next.
Thank you, Susan. I really, truly enjoyed all the 5 presentations in this session. I thought it was after lunch session, so I thought it would be difficult to keep awake, but it wasn't, because the presentations were so interesting. I do have a question to Hassan about the water implication of green wall as well as the energy in the desert, because often growing forests, particularly in arid regions, requires a lot of water and causes changes in the local hydrological cycle. Similarly, having a whole lot of solar panels on a desert will have a lot of sandstorms, so you would again need provision of water to clean those. I am guessing. So, and water footprint of mitigation is sometimes not actively taken into account while making these plans, and they can possibly compromise on some of these water security issues. So that was my question to Robert. I really enjoyed your presentation as well, particularly the part about India. I did think a lot of improvements happened there, but one of the of green, know it, but none of the Indian utilities are in the green. I mean, most of them are under deep red, so they are heavily bailed out by the government year after year, and this is in spite of very heavy subsidies, and we have had unbundling of our electricity companies. So I mean, all the things that World Bank would usually do that has been done, but yet electricity tends to be quite, and there I thought that the point you make around governance is super important. How the utility is governed has actually been the main determinant of which state utility has been able to move more aggressively towards renewable. So it's not really a question, but a comment that our electricity sector is also in deep trouble in spite of seemingly, good performance. And uh, often the one who bears most of this is really rural, where the electricity quality is often very poor, etc., etc. And finally, again, not so much of a question, but comment to Robin about I really like the 2 points you made, one about how difficult it is to measure adaptation. And we kind of do a lot of this discussion in the current working group 2 report. And I think in AR7, possibly there would be more research coming out of how to actually measure adaptation outcomes. I think that's a gray area. And another thing I don't think everybody knows that, but it doesn't come out, is it's just not adaptation, but underlying vulnerabilities that depends. So I think that those were the 2 points I really appreciated. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sheikh, you'd be next.
Thank you, Chair. Very good presentations. I'll quickly go to my brother from Sudan about the institutional framework on addressing many of those regional issues through the Great Green Wall, through the desert to power, and all those big things. So after observing the Sahel for many years, I have a sense that some of those big programs, which are very fundamental for transformation, are important and necessary, but they're not enough if we want to reach down the grassroots communities. Very few really are involved in the intellectual discussions that we are having when it comes to adaptation. So my point is how we can set a better understanding of the role of institutions in addressing those local issues. Obviously, in your presentation and the time given to you will never be enough to give all the landscape, the institutional landscape, particularly in West Africa. But we should recognize those important local institutions, communities of producers, village associations, youth organizations, which are not formal the way you could expect institutions to be. But these are social institutions which bear the challenge of really anchoring what the needs of adaptation are. I'm telling you because when we're dealing with the Great Green Wall, and that's something which I'm trying to push forward, is to make sure that the Great Green Wall is not just a national strategy. It should be in every single local strategy at county level, at very local level, and to involve those local institutions in the implementation of adaptation program. That is not the case. Technically speaking, the share of financing just undergoing the top-down approach, which is still ongoing, and that's really the last point on the institutions, particularly on the Great Green Wall. It's what I call too many cooks in the room. You have all kind of institutions: Alliance du Sahel, G5, African Development Bank, SOS Sahel, the accelerator of the UNCCD, different local NGOs, all of them trying to do things without consultation, without cohesive approach. They end up canceling what they do each other, or they're diluting their efforts into different threads that are not always adequate for local communities. That's something this integrated institutional approach, this cohesive approach between institutions is really lacking. I have a sense that there are more competition between them than really coalition of willing to implement big programs at regional level. Just want to have your sense on that. Now on the technology side, great presentation in Rwanda. You're facing the challenge of trying to be pragmatic and facing the political weight on how we perceive development policies. My question to you is, about the technology locked in. All those technology are imported. If you take water issues, my colleague Nitin just mentioned, you just do inverse osmosis, deep water pumping, even management of water pan or construction of small dams. These are techniques and technology which ignore local wisdom and knowledge and import those kind of information. And if you know that capacity, somebody mentioned education in the morning, if you know capacity is very weak and it's part of the adaptation education, how could you manage technology lock-in, which is the total dependency to China, when everything breaks, the total dependency to Germany, when everything breaks, the total dependency to Japan, to US, to France, when just a single screw is missing, that technology locking might be an impediment of the process towards scaling up those kind of solutions. And that's the question I'm having for you. How can we manage transfer technology, but also transfer or how to manage technology at local level? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think next I have Marcello.
Congratulations for all presentation, and in reality is for more for all, but I want to specific to ask to Virgilio, because I know the work that do Virgilio for many years. What is the difference that you have in your work between the program of the sustainable development and the program of resilience? Are the same, or you change something because this new idea of resilience, new idea more or less, but are not in the goals? So.
Thank you. We'll answer all of these kind of in a moment, but let's first hear from Joyce. Your question.
Thank you, Susan, for the flow, and thanks to the 4 presenters for this afternoon. My questions are directed to Robert and Virgilio, and I'll start with Robert. So as we encourage the shift to cleaner sources of energy, I would like to get your reflections or opinions on issues of sustainability and also reliability. And on sustainability, I want to ask your reflections or get your reflections on use of electricity or generation of electricity supply from hydropower generation, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And I would like you to reflect more as we go into, as we experience the impact of recurrent droughts, which really affect water flows. And I would also want you to reflect on the impact of ecology and physical characteristics of the rivers from hydropower plants. So that's the first question. The other question is on reliability. I would like you to reflect or get your opinions on reliability of energy from solar and wind, especially for industrial operations and for power, that is power intensive activities. And to Virgilio, really I must commend the work you're doing in the Amazon. I think that is really, very impressive. And I would just like to know about your experience on the participatory approach you're applying in looking for sustainability solutions for the Amazon, especially scientists working with indigenous people. So how is that? And the reason I ask that is because it's not been easy for, so so we try to co-produce climate information, especially in Africa, climate services with scientists working with indigenous people for co-production of climate information. It's not been easy, but we've made substantive progress in this, and it's become very useful. And I would like to know how are you working, so in a way of having a participatory approach, how are scientists working with indigenous people? How is the complementarities and the synergies of the two knowledge systems in the provision of the sustainability solutions for the Amazon? Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to take one more comment now, and we'll allow the presenters to respond, and then if we have more time, I'll add the late-breaking questions from John and Victor. And the comment that I'd like to invite now is from Jochen.
All the speeches made a contribution to a solution, so thank you. I have the following information and question. Virgilio, when we ask people about their experience with climate change, people in marginal rural communities, East Africa, Bangladesh, for instance, we did that about 9 years ago. A very large percentage gives clear answers on the indications what's happening, so that climate change is there. So in that respect, our workshop comes late. And then asking, what are you doing about it? I simplify a more complex set of inquiries. So these are not just anecdotes, they are structured surveys. We see a great diversity in terms of what women do and what men do. I think we have not sufficiently covered that so far in our discussions here. By the way, in East African, most of the settings, women plant trees and men try to get irrigation in. It can easily be explained in how the economy is handled. And then there is a second thing happening. What are you doing individually and what are you doing collectively? And you had some collective action in your responses. And we were amazed how strong collective action comes about. So existing savings and credit and insurance, self-insurance schemes in groups are adapted to climate resilience issues. So lots of women's groups, for instance, both in Kenya and in Bangladesh. How is that happening in indigenous communities? What do you see in Brazil in that respect? I think we need to understand these social responses which actually are combined with technological choices and choices for infrastructure demand. And that brings me to you, Robert. I think it's extremely important to get the energy sector moving, but resilience would benefit from joint investment in other infrastructures. So the science of that is pretty strong, to have it combined with communications infrastructure, with water infrastructure, and with transport infrastructure. So what's your experience in that respect? The single sector approach to overcome the energy poverty may not be optimal.
Okay, well, we have lots of great questions for all four speakers, and I think I'd like to call on Rob to respond first, please. Yep.
Okay. Well, let me go backwards because Joachim's question is fresh on my mind. Is a very good point that a single sector focus can be beyond non-optimal, be downright wrong. One of the tenets of our integrated distribution framework, which I glanced over too fast, was the idea that electrification has to be economically impactful. If you unpack that, it means an embellishment of that is that investments by government, programs set up by government, have to be coordinated across sectors. So I fully agree with you, and that's something that we've worried quite a lot. And my experience is that if you don't do that, then you do have failures. Going backwards to Joyce, do I keep going? A slide I skipped over, Joyce, was on regional power pools in Africa. Power pools are a feature of the electricity systems of just about every advanced country. We trade power across state lines, across national borders, and so on, specifically to bring to bear a diversity of generation types and assets. It means that states that don't generate their own power can procure power from others. It means that states that overgenerate, for example, from hydrogen or hydro, can sell their hydro to other countries. And other countries can use that hydro generation, as it's often used, to mitigate variation in renewables. So Africa is lagging in the creation of power pools. They've been talked about for decades. One of the reasons they haven't developed is that electricity markets themselves have been lagging at the distribution level and need to be built up. They have, though, reached a point in many countries of having excess supply. And for the economic viability of those generation assets, they're going to have to form pools or they're going to become white elephants. And so I think more than ever, there's an impetus to push forward in creating regional power pools. It's sort of making some progress in West Africa. South Africa has a power pool. It's hugely dysfunctional because of a lack of transmission capacity. But my sense is that the World Bank has given up on power pools. They're not focusing enough attention on them. Tony Blair, and Tony Blair Institute, by the way, is putting a lot of effort into reinvigorating the discussion to try to get them done. So that's an answer in part to all of your questions about providing resiliency for the failure of hydro systems in some countries. We've had spectacular failures in Kenya and Zambia at different times, but also for enabling renewable power to come in a way that provides continuous power throughout the system. The system's got to be big and diverse. Czech, I don't know what to say about local manufacturing, or the localization of technology manufacturing. India has similar problems in some sectors with advanced technologies. My colleagues in universities are constantly complaining about how hard it is to procure scientific equipment, for example, that may be specialized and made outside of India, and how hard it is to get it repaired. That's a corner of the answer. I think the bigger answer, maybe too big, is that we've clearly overshot with globalization and the concentration of low-cost commodity manufacturing in China. And clearly, governments are backing away from that, recognizing that that is inherently unresilient. And we're paying the price now through inflation in many sectors. And we're going to have to, I think, re-indigenize manufacturing, not only in African countries, but in advanced economies as well. That's thinking that has to take place. And I think it may lead to a re-examination of supply chains and technologies that admit more regional sourcing and complete assembly of things, rather than having to bring things from all around the world and then concentrating them in China again. And then I finally, Aditi, you asked about, well, you commented that I had maybe overstated India's performance in electrification. What I meant to say, if I didn't say it, was that they've been very successful in stringing up wires, but you're quite right. They do still have substantial hangover from the extreme state control of electric utilities and generation over many, many years. But there's been progress there. And two things come to mind. First is that Piyush Goyal, when he was the Minister of Power, Coal and Renewable Energy, created a program that enabled states to actually issue federal government bonds to make themselves whole, provided that they agreed to a package of reforms that included cost recoverable tariffs, investments in reliability, customer service, and so on. which has been beneficial and I think goes in the right direction. They still need mechanisms to do that effectively. So the other part of the story is that Tata Power, and to some degree Reliance, have been demonstrating how in urban environments, and I'm thinking particularly of Delhi, you can create concessional schemes for the distribution company, and they did it very well with North Delhi Power and later Tata Power, that established a pact between the government and the company that says, on the part of the company, look, we're going to improve reliability of service. We're going to do long-term generation agreements with generators around the city. We'll commit to those things, and we will improve the reliability on an ordered basis over perhaps a decade. The government, in turn, has to say, okay, we will allow you to, or rather, we will procure power for you, and we'll give it to you at the rate that enables you to be cost recoverable, and we will absorb the loss as the state. That scheme has now been replicated in a couple of concessions that are less exceptional in Delhi, which is a rich city, and include rural as well as urban centers. And I'm thinking particularly of Gujarat and more recently Odisha. And so this idea of extending concession schemes with the participation of government as a subsidizer into more complex environments, I think is the second part of the story that Goyal initiated. I'll leave it there and get on with the other.
Mohammed, you also had some questions, particularly from Sheikh, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have two questions. One from Maditi, and I think you refer to the Africa Great Green Wall and the impact, the long-term impact on the environment. The point I wanted to make first is that this is really a nature-based, ecosystem-based initiative on adaptation and mitigation. Because this strip, this Sahelian strip that I just highlighted, used to be very rich in biodiversity, and the climate was different. But because of wind erosion and the encroachment of sand and desertification moving south, it has changed to what it is now. So the whole idea is how to do restoration, to rebuild it more or less in the same way that it was before. So even the trees and the forests that they want to plant will certainly be more or less the same as they were before. So it's really an effort of restoration. In that sense, I don't expect anything disastrous to happen to the environment. But it is, the question I think is very interesting, and in the sense that is it really going to change the climate? I mean, the moisture in the region is certainly going to increase. But is this really going to affect, for example, the erosion? Is the erosion going to stop? Is the sand encroachment going to be reduced substantially? Because the area itself hopefully is going to be rich, is going to be important for living, day-to-day living of the communities. Lots of agricultural schemes are going to be built to benefit people. But stopping the erosion, I think, is going to be the most important aspect of it. And I think there's good reason to believe that the wind erosion and the encroachment of sand and the movement of the desert southwards is going to be reduced substantially. So this is what I think will come. But it needs more study. There is no doubt about that. It's not something that one can do just by guessing. It needs proper scientific study, and I don't think that has really been completed. Sheikh, I agree what you have said about institutions. I think it's very important, but I think let us distinguish between two types of institutions. The institutions I focused on here are those that the design and drive policies and initiate programs like this initiative of AAAP between the African Development Bank and the Global Climate Center, Global Adaptation Center. But what is really important is after you design the programs and the activities, and hopefully you find the funding for it, what are you going to do? And this is where I think your comment comes in very clearly, that you need individuals, you need trained people, you need education, you need expertise to implement the programs and activities. And this is something that I agree with you should be done immediately. As you move on with the policy, institutions that design the policy, you have to also think of how you can train the individuals so that once you have the funds and you have the program launched, you have the people, the expertise who are going to drive the solution somehow. So I agree with what you have said. Thank you.
Okay, Virgilio, you had quite a few questions, so the floor is yours to answer them, please.
Thank you. The first question was by Alisher about the payment for restoration and underwear. The answer is it depends. There are various cases. For tree planting, there is direct payment. For management of fisheries, for example, there is no payment directly for the management itself, but there is return from the products that come as a result of the management. For environmental conservation, for ecosystem services, there is cash payment in our case. For social infrastructure, there is voluntary work. So, for example, sometimes we build schools and we provide just the material, and then the community builds the school. And then the government puts in the teachers. So we do a sort of a combined arrangement. So that's how it goes. It's a diverse situation. Marcelo asked about resilience, if the work on sustainable development is different from the resilience. And my question, Marcelo, my answer is, it's the same work with different objectives. We follow the line of thinking of Pope Francis that it's necessary to have integral human development. So in our view, integral human development is an objective in itself, but also is a strategy to build resilience. So we see resilience as a sort of an outcome of integral human development. If we want to have a resilient society, we have to promote integral human development. That's how we see that. Joyce asked about the participatory approach in scientists. We have basically two types of approaches. One is passive, the other is active. Passive is our students that are doing masters, PhDs, whatever, and they come to us to ask for our data to do research. And we do that. We have had to create a sort of a department just to make that interface with our researchers and create a code of ethics for the researchers so that the researchers are required to sign a commitment to give back, to give some feedback after the research is done, because oftentimes students are very crazy to get their work done, but then when they finish, they disappear. So we create a sort of protocol that they have to give feedback to the communities or to us as a foundation. And in terms of the active approach, we search partners, for example, business schools, to look at value chains. So we have partnered with several business schools to examine the value chains and do calculations and identify problems and solutions. And in terms of ethics, I think it's very important to make a distinction between utilitarian research and relevant research. Oftentimes, indigenous peoples are just used to to provide case for dissertation, whatever. So I think we have more and more to move towards relevant research. That it's not only for the researchers themselves, but also for the people that are engaged in that enterprise, because it takes a lot of time. A researcher can be a headache. You have to take the researcher from here to there, answer questions, long questions, and so on. So it's an investment. So it's only fair that the subject matter is relevant to the local community. And Joaquim asked about the indigenous people's perception on climate change and what they're doing, the difference between men and women. I'll tell you two very short stories. One is a case of internal migration of indigenous peoples from upper Rio Negro to down Rio Negro, to lower Rio Negro. And the reason for that migration is depletion of fisheries. So the shortage of fish has become a driver of internal migration. That's within the same region. In general, women are more responsible for agricultural production than men. Men is usually more associated with the fishing and hunting and extraction of forest products. In the case of the Amazon, there is a very interesting particularity of a high diversity of genetic material. For example, there's just one case that comes to my mind. The Baniwa Indians have 70 species of pepper. They love pepper, and they do sort of a kind of black pepper, a ground pepper, and 70 species. And likewise, they have many varieties of pineapples, for example. And that genetic diversity, I think, is a very important asset. There's a case in Peru, in Peruvian Amazon, where they've created a fantastic program of a local grassroots organization that women caretakers of genetic diversity of indigenous plants. So they are sort of a special agent just to take care of genetic resources. That's beautiful. And I think this is a case that should be replicated. This is not done by us, but a partner organization. And a final point on the impacts of climate change, I'll tell another story. There are recent attacks of monkeys and wild pigs on agricultural plots. And these animals are suffering hunger. That's what the indigenous people say. They're hungry. So they're not finding food in the forest because climate change is affecting the seasonality of fruit production. So trees are not flowering, fruiting at the time that they should be flowering, fruiting. So they starve and then they go to agricultural plots, and that becomes trees, humans, and these wild animals. And finally, a point with Sheikh. Sheikh asked an issue about institutional framework to Mohammed, but just to share a brief experience. Supporting grassroots organization is key. And we have a little bit of experience on that. We support 16 organizations, and management skills are very important. Just management, basic management, project management, do accounting, and proper transparency in terms of benefit sharing and so on, and providing infrastructure and operational costs. So we need to subsidize grassroots organizations to defend their rights, like Bob Marley would sing, stand up for your right. Yes, so we need to have support to grassroots organizations so that they can stand up for their rights, fighting for education, health, and so on. Usually those indigenous peoples are abandoned by policymakers at the local level for a very clear reason. They have few votes, and it's more expensive to provide assistance to them because they're far away. So they tend to be neglected. So there is a very strong case, in my view, for supporting with grant money local grassroots organizations. Thank you.
Robin, did you want to make any comments on anything?
Yeah. Let me just say, I think I only have one question to answer. You'll be glad to hear. To offset that, it's not an easy question to answer. How do we measure adaptation? I think in terms of what we do know about the issue, despite some excellent examples heard about today, I think too few adaptation interventions are imposed, implemented without the commitment to measure. So we need to build that commitment early on in thinking about intervention. And indeed, too little recognition that the outcome you want to measure may be different in the short term and the long term. I argue for more focus on health metrics as a outcome for many adaptations. But even there, there's potentially a number of different measures. For example, is it the quality of health? Is it degree of accessibility on the way to universal health coverage? So we need to think even there about different metrics. One other point, while I think we've heard and discussed how adaptation actions are often locally based, but by contrast with some of the mitigation actions which are public good, even though they may be locally in design and recommendation, we may need a more general framework for measurement that the local action can fit into. But having said that, the other missing piece of evidence in many examples is the involvement of the local community in assessing the outcomes and contributing to what should be the measurement. Too often it's imposed by the local donor or funder or whatever. And again, we need to emphasize the involvement of those who are most affected by the intervention.
Okay, thank you. I see that John has graciously taken his flag down. No, you haven't taken your flag down. Oh, boy. Okay, so we have 3 people who want to make really quick interventions. And my suggestion is that you just go ahead and make your statement quickly, like 1 minute, and then walk back or ride back to the building with your person you want to ask the question of. Go ahead, John.
Okay. No, so I will skip actually several of my questions. Just one question, most important one. The air conditioning in this room, is this climate neutral or not? Because it's so cold here. And yeah, is it? Okay. No, come on. It's very cold here. So it's not a really serious question, but I wonder, because it's at least 15 degrees cooler here than outside and has to come from somewhere. Yeah. So that was my question, but I have a remark for Robin, actually, because I think he gave a very interesting talk. We also did some analysis comparing COVID-19 and the climate crisis. And of course, the timescales are completely different. But in both cases, you have highly nonlinear dynamics. So, and it's precisely important that you understand the whole system, and when you pick the right intervention point. And so, for example, the world could have been spared the pandemic if the Chinese would have intervened in the right point in time. Or the UK might have succeeded with the herd immunity if the rest of the world would have complied with that. So it's a highly nonlinear system. I think the lessons have not been analyzed to a great extent. We can learn much more from that. With climate change, it's precisely the same thing. We have passed and missed many of the intervention points, but we try to catch up with the old strategies for the new dynamics. So we are in a very similar situation. And actually, the complete response of the world in every country to COVID-19 was really lousy. I just want to leave it with you.
Thank you. I'm going to suggest you talk together on the way home. Victor, and then last word for Oscar.
Thank you. I have a question to Virgilio from a resilience angle, and thanks to all speakers for great talks, it is about the limits to adaptation in the Amazon, from your experience. I mean, in terms of the projects that you're doing and your understanding on the ground, are the limits to adaptation, and where are those limits to adaptation in the Amazon region? And a related question to that, this idea and aim to create a bioeconomy for the Amazon, would that bioeconomy look the same in a 1 degree world compared to a 2 degree world? Or would those two economies actually look very different because the planet or the climate would be different? Two short questions, but I guess.
I think the second question's easy. The answer is yes. It'd be really different, 2 degrees than 1 degree. But I think the rest of it, go ahead, Virgilio.
Also easy. The first question is also easy. I don't know. We don't know the limits to adaptation, but that's a very good question. We should, research that. What are the responses with different scenarios, especially what John was talking about, the catastrophic scenario, what would happen, especially in the case of fisheries. Fisheries are very important for food security in the Amazon. It's the most important source of protein. And we just don't know how fish species are going to behave under different conditions. There is some research already, but we don't know very well.
Thank you. Esther?
Thank you. Very interesting, presentations, but I have a question for Robin, you mentioned a lot about climate change and health, but if I remember correctly, there are also issues with deforestation, and the health issue. For example, like malaria is related with land use change and deforestation. And you have this One Health approach of WHO in your manifestation that relates, the plant health, the animal health, the wildlife health. And do you have any practical, how's it moving? And how complicated or easy it is to bring all the sectors together?
Okay, well, let me try and answer very briefly. I mean, the general point that you raise is very important. Of course, the interactions or the impacts of climate change on health do have to take into account other environmental changes such as land use change, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, and so on. And that would be a whole additional talk to discuss that. But indeed, I think if one looks at the policy initiatives, there's still too much disconnect between, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Framework Convention for Climate Change. We need to bring together the different issues, possibly in a One Health approach. But certainly we need to, I focused on human health, but clearly there are many relevant issues for animal health themselves, so that it has impact on human health through farming and agricultural systems, and also through zoonoses and so on. So indeed, there are many connections, and a One Health or planetary health approach it is very helpful in framing some of these questions.
Everybody a round of applause and declare the session over. Thank you very much. I guess we reconvene.
Well, let me first thank you, Susan, for splendid sharing. I see applause without even asking. Colleagues, Victor, you have thrown a question into this room in an earlier session. You asked, what's the influence, the impact of things like Laudato Si? We cannot let this hanging because that touches the raison d'etre of this academy. And I'm grateful that you asked this question. Of course, we are biased. because this academy was substantively involved in at least chapter 1 of the encyclical Laudato Si. But there is literature, and there's a fairly new article in a Springer book that came out this year on impact of Laudato Si. Actually, it is partly impact and it's mainly on influence. They did online surveys. About 80% of the respondents said the influence was strong or very strong. And they did, these are two authors from Belgium, not members of the Academy or affiliated with the Vatican. I can give you the source. They did word searches and language analysis of papers, policy papers discussing Laudato Si. So what comes out from here directly or indirectly finds its way into people's minds. That Laudato Si was referenced and read a lot more frequently than the Rio Declaration is an anecdote which I wouldn't quote in this context, but I just have. So it's a good news that the Office of the Pope has released today the statement in 4 different word languages, not just in the one which is here on the table. And those of you who speak a rare language, translate it. But Italian, Spanish, English, French, German is already out. And we will try to follow suit with at least a summary of our statement. Your homework, your night shift, if you like to do it, is scribble something and scratch paragraphs of the lengthy document which you have taken. Susan, you mentioned already, this is very long, so we need to prioritize. So hand it back and toss it here on the table. For a closing comment or question, I pass on to our Chancellor. Chancellor?
If I may tag on briefly onto the Laudato Si question. When it was published in the light of the discussion we have in here, Boston College invited to a discussion of that, and they invited, so the organizers had our dicastery, so the product came out of our dicastery a little bit. So we and the climate scientists of Obama's government, we met in Boston College, and the thing was to discuss the content of Laudato Si, where the Pope overstated issues or where he understated issues. And to a large extent, the climate scientists agree with the Pope's statement of it perfectly, and in fact said that in other places you could have even been more emphatic on, on issues and everything there. But again, in the light of our discussion today, probably it's good in the light of the interrelatedness of all the issues we've discussed. It's good for those who are not familiar with Laudato Si to recognize that the central teaching of Laudato Si is about integral ecology. Ecology is not just nature, it is social, it is human, it's all of these. And so it invites us to consider the interrelatedness of all the issues that we deal with, and our discussion today is just proving that. The resilience or the adaptation, everything that it's not limited where it affects everything. And the point of Laudato Si invites us to recognize the interrelatedness of all of these issues. And so our solutions try also to imitate that. If it helps, to mark the 10th anniversary of Laudato Si, which was 2010, 5th anniversary, we invited different readers to make a statement. And so we put them all together. Tomorrow, if I don't forget, I'll bring a copy, or probably ask Jostrom, who now keeps the copies, to send some copies about the Laudato to See reader. It starts from the Pope, goes to the UN Secretary General, and then the presidents, and then the heads of state, and all of these different authors. So that's about Laudato Si. My own thing, I wanted to just, the issue about African Union and the initiatives in the desert and all. It was one of the popes, Pope Paul VI, who said that development is the new name of peace. But peace, on the other hand, development, on the other hand, requires peace. Now, the initiative we talked about, the Green Wall and all of that, for the sub-region, we also know now that it is also the area of greatest instability and insecurity. How do we put the two together? Where the Green Wall or whatever has to pass is where the Boko Harams and the Jihad, all of these groups are also operating there. And it's a big challenge. I wonder whether the vision of the AU can be realized under these conditions, or, I mean, what's their own, how do they intend to proceed with all the projects that they have in the sub-region under these hostile, if you want, conditions? So that's a thing. Third one is to share an experience about the Amazon and whatever. There is a project in Southern Africa now, South Africa, that intends to revive and to reintroduce traditional fruits which have been abandoned because of the arrival of imported fruit trees. So Nestle is supporting a project in South Africa to reintroduce traditional fruit trees which are, as it were, extinct on account of foreign fruits importation and all of that. But on the same, for the same reason, ironically, South Africa, of all places now, has power cuts. South Africa cannot ensure smooth and perfect flow of electricity. So if you have partners in South Africa and they're now calling you on the phone because there's no power. And this, for South Africa, is a thing to worry about. Just as for the AU also, I worry. Because AU projects will require foreign funding. So all the institutions and the projects that you mentioned, ultimately for their realization will require foreign funding. And that makes it very vulnerable and fragile. And while I wish they would all come to pass, I would not be surprised if for one reason or the other, they don't. I'm not pessimistic, but this is the experience I think was made with NEPAD. And then we have this experience. So I wonder, so it's just thoughts thrown out there. I'm not sure whether, if you want to react, I can meet you also at dinner, but
Very quickly, I think the Great Green Wall, I think it is a distributed type of implementation. So every country, I think there are about 13 to 14 countries along this strip, but every country should have the responsibility of doing the job locally. So it's really distributed. But the issue you raised about security and the Boko Haram and all these things is a clear threat. But whatever you do, I think there will be this threat somehow. Yeah.